Okay. So yeah, hoodwink test with Faker. I'm sorry, usually I rely on Alan to come up with the names for my presentations, and he's in Vancouver now, so, or Victoria.
Well, we had some wonderful suggestions.
Yeah, and I ignored them. So first thing, Faker. Faker is a gem that you can include in your project. It provides pseudo-random data. It's not 100% random because it is coming from a list that they have. It can provide a degree of uniqueness for you. So instead of saying like every time you go to create a person in your test data, instead of having John Doe 1, John Doe 3, etc., 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 you can have some semi-realistic names, some actual variation. And yeah, it simplifies the creation of large data sets or even not large data sets. So for example, again, creation of tests, perhaps you need to populate it with some of the data. Faker makes that easy. So basic usage is you call Faker and then you call the class. Do I have my mouse up there? Oh, cool, I do. Call the class, so in this case, Faker name. And then there's usually a set of subclasses on that top level class that gives you some variety. So for example, here you can call Faker name. You might get Rosaria Howe, PhD. This includes a random title. Mr. Frank Wolf or Verna Christensen. Those are all very unique names that I generated last night. And no, that pulled me over, but that's fine. I'm going to increase this. So again, if I can type. Mr. Goldner, Furman Rogan, you can keep going indefinitely, and you may see some duplicates, but probably not in the name class, because if I recall, it's pretty friggin' massive, so you're unlikely to run into duplicates there. Nope. I lost my presentation. So that's a very basic usage. Again, most common usage, most of the time I've seen Faker, it's being used it to generate names for your users or clients or whatever what you have in your project that is a person that needs a name. It can also be used to generate more than just names though. So for example, there's an address class that you can use to generate addresses. Whether they're valid or not, I don't know if Google would accept them, but they exist. You can also get phone number. These are all having extensions, but again, just random numbers. And format, by the way, for phone number is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed to be in North American. You can specify that explicitly, but otherwise you could get European numbers, you could get phone numbers, you can get numbers with extensions is what I got here. And then, or you could get jobs. So banking technician, accounting representative, all sorts of different data in there as well. So those are kind of some of the more basic classes, but you also have other things. So for example, Faker has some lorem ipsum generation. You can get sentences, you can get words, you can specify the number of words in your sentence. So for example, if you're trying to generate a paragraph of whatever for whatever testing purposes, you can still use Faker to get that accomplished as well. I'm not going to try and pronounce that because my Latin is not great. Other things you can get, company names. So similar to the job, maybe you want to get name a bunch of companies in your data. And again, not have it just be company 1, company 2, company 3. Get something pseudo-random, get something a little bit more likely. And in some cases, Faker will actually provide non-UTF characters for you as well. So that can be a good way to test and see like, hey, does my stuff support this? And again, might not be every case, but eventually it'll pop up and suddenly your tests fail and then you're sitting there, it's like, oh, maybe this should be better. You can also get alphabet, phonetic alphabet. That one's a little bit more finite, but it's another thing that you've got in Faker. And again, this is just a small subset of what Faker has. I really recommend reading the docs because it's crazy what they've got, including you can get items from Legend of Zelda video games, like the Deku Shield, the Horse Call, which I'm trying to think, I think that was Twilight Princess, Hero Sword, again, giant list that you can get. Maybe you're a big fan of Hey Arnold and just want to get characters from that TV show. Again, another thing you can do. Or if you're a huge movie buff, maybe you just like Big Lebowski quotes, which again, for some reason that's a library that Faker has. So, like I said, there's so much in there than Faker. If I go back, not to Postman, sorry. If I go back to their docs, they have a very large list. I'm going to zoom in so people can actually read this, of their generators. And just, there's quite a bit in there. Pretty much anything that you want to generate, they've got generic versions of. If you're Shakespeare quotes, apparently. I'm not sure what the sports basketball is. Let's find out. Gives you teams, players, coaches, and positions. Something to note is that because Faker is coming off of a series of JSON lifts inside of the gem, they may not be up to date, although they do welcome pull requests to keep things up to date and improve their existing data. So that's always something you can do as well if you're bored or want to improve it. There's tons of TV shows. Some of them are quotes, some of them are characters. Again, you'd have to actually take a look at them to understand what's available for them. So some of the caveats, as you can see here, so if I do Faker gender type, there is a possibility that I'll get the same one repeated. And I did pick this one because it's got a much smaller list than some of the things like name. I didn't want to be sitting there generating names for the next 12 hours to find duplicates. So again, Faker will give you some degree of uniqueness, but uniqueness is not guaranteed. There will be duplicates, there will be repeats. They do provide the ability to avoid this by calling unique on it. What that will do is that'll set up, it'll remember basically what options it's given you. And so when you run out, by the way, gender has 3, 6, 7, 8 different options in it. Once you've exhausted all of those options, instead of giving you another value, it will actually give you an error about how it's run out of values to give you. So that can be helpful if you actually do require uniqueness. You can also wipe out your existing, your remembered list of values that you've been given already by Faker. Again, this is kind of a bit of an edge case. For most cases, I don't know why you would really need to guarantee uniqueness. But if you do, there is a way to do it. It's not ideal, but it does exist. As a bit of a bonus, I did call out a bit with lorem ipsum. You can specify how many sentences it would give you. Some of the tools will actually take arguments. So, for example, here I asked for a quote from the Dota library. By default, it'll always use the hero Abaddon. So, from House of Avernus, I set forth is an Abaddon quote. If you're a Dota fan, if you're not, that's information that you may or may not care about. You can use it to specify the hero. So, for example, I tried to request a quote from the hero Io, and it gave me a very informative information that Io does not talk. For those who are confused, Io is a floating ball of light. Asking for another hero, and I do get a quote from that specific hero because they do have quotes in the library for it. So there's a whirlwind tour of Faker. I think I might have been quicker than Andy in my presentation, but like I said, it's a very, very broad library. The uses, generally it's used for testing, but you could use it if you need to generate a large amount of data for your production for load testing or something similar. It doesn't necessarily need to be used exclusively in a test environment. Recommended, because why do you want super random data in production? But, you know, to each their own. So yeah, are there any questions or comments, or anyone else want to add anything? You have. Yeah, so a lot of jobbers test frameworks with FactoryBot are using Faker to generate names.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you could integrate it with.
Yep, you can, 100%.
But Faker with FactoryBot
Is a really common
the bomb.
paradigm. So, oh, that is super tiny. So, for example, in this project, did I actually, I'm pretty sure I used Faker in this, but we'll find out. Yeah, so for example, here is a FactoryBot. And if you're not familiar, FactoryBot is a way to kind of create models for your tests without actually, it provides a shorthand for creating your models. So for example here, when I create a player, using the create a player factory, I've actually got Faker set up to provide me a name. So every single time I call create player with this factory, it's going to call Faker name and toss me a random name that Faker has generated. And some of them will be quite silly. Some of them will be less so. Brigida, they actually have a library funny name. Just Insane, Max Little, Lunatic, Hairy Armpits. So, like I said, some of the Faker libraries are definitely a little bit more serious than others, but if you're looking for something goofy, there's lots of things in there as well.
It's like a well-recognized project, but I think a lot of people would know. So
Yeah.
if you did just spend like an afternoon like introducing like Rick and Morty quotes or something.
Yeah,
At
there's
least like put that on your resume to get into some like big Faker.
open source contributor.
Open source contributor on Faker, yeah.
Open source for
Yeah.
that's right.
As a bit of an aside, it looks like, I don't know if this was the first of these kind of gems, but I do know that there's similar libraries for JavaScript.
It's based on the Perl library, also called Faker.
Okay,
So the Perl library came first, and
and now that everyone's copying
I'm not
them.
sure if this was like the second one. Like,
Yeah.
This was the first sort of re-implementation of it.
I feel like it was fairly early because I've seen
Oh,
most of the
yeah,
other
it's-
projects are saying like
I would
copying
use
the
it
Ruby
as-
Faker library.
I'm gonna say for over a decade.
Yeah, so again, like if I pull up,
If you're doing any testing, you should, Faker is one of the gems that I automatically include. I'll include Faker and not Devise. Let me put it that way.
I'd rather deal with Faker than Devise for sure.
Well, yeah, but I mean, for a lot of people, the first gem that they include is Devise, and I'm saying, I actually have a bit of a rule about things. I feel that there's less technical debt to the things
I can't go
that
back.
are for your test only,
Oh,
because
especially if it's like in your gem file like group test or whatever.
Yeah,
Faker,
exactly.
Yeah.
like, there you go.
and Faker goes into your test and stuff like that, and you can also use it when you're doing development just to run things up.
Yeah, I think I generally include it as, yeah, so here you can see I've got
Development
Faker as development and test so that I can use it in development as easily as I can in test.
Yeah.
And
Database cleaner, factory bot rails, Faker.
to be fair, I'm looking at this and thinking I kind of screwed this up because database cleaner should definitely not be in development.
No, that's test only. Yeah.
Except when you do, sometimes some of my apps just still do.
But yeah, FactoryBot and Faker I definitely use in both dev and in tests. So FactoryBot I would question a bit more if you had it in production, but Faker I wouldn't be surprised if you had it in top level as well. Because again, it does provide value. You probably shouldn't be filling your production database with a whole bunch of random, generally.
You could theoretically put Faker into production if you were providing random default values for things. Like placeholder values.
Yeah,
So-
like prototypes for clients and stuff, where you're just trying to do like the quickest, crappiest little Rails app and get stuff on the page for them.
Or even things, so Faker has an avatar library which will create images for you. So that could actually be a use case where it's like every user must have an avatar. And rather than have like half a dozen that you have to generate yourself, Faker can provide you a randomized avatar. So, again, bit of a contrived example, but there are situations that I wouldn't be surprised to see it in a production environment.
So among the things that you can do is if, for instance, like in the database side of things, if you're testing your validations, so your columns on your database, your
I'm
names may
curious.
only be 100 characters, right? You can actually tell Faker to generate something that's longer to make sure that your validator fails.
Yeah, as I mentioned, so if I take a look at the Lorem library again, so
Yeah, Lorem has quite a few.
you can have you can fetch a set number of words, or you can get sentences with full word counts. You can get full paragraphs. Again, like this would be a good situation to say like, hey, does it handle 20 paragraphs worth of data? And rather than have to copy and paste and write, you know, this is a sentence, this is a sentence, this is part of a paragraph, and then copy and paste that 20 times or whatever. Here's a shortcut to generate that sort of data.
Hey, you mentioned that, like, if you run a test and it fails because of some faker data in there, is there like a seed that you can get so you can rerun it again?
There is actually.
That's
So-
built into Rails test though, and should theoretically flow through to.
Where is that? Sorry, I was reviewing all this documentation last night. So yeah, deterministic random. So you can configure a very specific random state, which should give you the repeated results. Now, I don't think you can get that after the fact.
Yeah, because that's what you, like, when you run like a mini test or something with the seed,
Yeah.
and your test failed because they ran it in a certain order, it tells you the seed, you can rerun it and be like, oh, okay, I can.
Yeah, then so same with RSpec. The trick is though, if your tests are clear enough that hey, it failed because, you know, I expected this and got whatever instead,
Yeah.
you should be able to get have a look at what that character was and manually inject it
Yeah.
into it. Again, it's not ideal to rely on a random generation of those kind of characters, but
Yeah, but once you get the failure, you want to be able to reproduce it.
yeah, for sure.
But oftentimes the test will fail with enough information, or if it's like a system test,
Yeah.
it'll take like a screenshot. And
Yeah.
that's what I think Faker
I
does
love the
for-
company BS.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Yeah, like I said, there's so many.
So the address one, you can actually set it up for different locales, like so for instance, if you want a UK address.
Yes, there is. So where am I?
So, because
Address.
I've actually done that with the addresses and you get specific things.
Yeah, so you can specifically say like, hey, I'm looking for an address, like a U.S. style address, and it can give you that kind of information. You can also say like, hey, instead of getting a full address, just give me a randomized zip code or a postal code. Or again, like I said, it's pretty much impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but I don't think we want to sit here for 4 hours while I go over every single library. So if you are interested in Faker, I'd really recommend just taking a look at the docs. You don't have to remember everything that's in there.
Yeah, the docs are pretty easy.
But
You can find what you need.
yeah, and they've also got like every single one of them has this sort of page where it's like, okay, here's all of the things that you can call on it, and here's kind of the example of what you'll see after the fact. So here, like educator, you can get a university, secondary school, degree, random course name, random subject, a campus sort of thing. Hacker, you can see say something smart, apparently. I don't know if that's really that smart, but okay. Yeah, so again, I really recommend taking a look through it
They put that in
because
to generate all the dialogue for what's the show that just ended?
IT crowd or
No. Mr. Robot? Yeah, Mr. Robot. There we go.
I mean, you random beer. There's some superhero libraries. Again, I freaking love it, and just it's amazing how much people have added to it, and they've got these blockchain libraries.
So at what point do they start splitting it out? Now there's just a gem for each one. So I only want the games library, but there's like now like a megabyte overhead.
Well, because it's in test, I mean,
I know, I'm just throwing it out.
it's, yeah, it doesn't, I don't think, that's one of the things, right? It doesn't pollute what you're doing, other than the fact that it's, you know, generating stuff, and you have to generate stuff either by hand or come up with some way of doing it, right?
Static
Yeah.
data, it's not
So,
doing anything.
For an example, this is all handled via I18N, by the way. So here's like the example is the Buffy library. So if you're a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, And it's just a YAML file with a large set of lists, basically.
Does it load it on demand, or does it just load all that stuff into memory on startup?
I'm not entirely sure, but I've never noticed any particular slowdown when using Faker versus not.
Fair enough.
But that's,
Trying to squeeze out every little
yeah, it's
kilobyte of RAM or whatever.
Yeah, it's purely anecdotal evidence for myself. I've never done any aggressive testing on that because I've never needed to. Honestly, I think as far as libraries go, despite the fact that it does have like an absolute crazy number of these YAML files, and in different languages as well. Again, I've never found it being like, oh no, we've got this gem that is, every time it loads up, it takes 10 megabytes of RAM. I actually doubt it takes that much. If it's hitting a meg, maybe.
So how much is on the computer you're running right now in terms of RAM?
Oh, this I think is 16 gigs, so. And this one's 5 years old, so.
I'm sure the browser window that you're running is actually taking more.
I can pretty much guarantee it. It's Chrome, so it's trying to nom all my RAM.
Think about the number of just like wasted bytes that are just like constantly transferred over the internet back and forth. It could be like made more efficient. A lot of data.
Well, yeah, and that's so your statement I think is fair, particularly if you're looking at if you had a reason, a use case where you were doing it in production, how much memory does it take?
Yeah.
But
And-
I think the general use case is that it's in your test or your test and development.
Which-
It's not making it to production.
Yeah, and it's generally okay if your tests are a little bit inefficient, because if you're trying to
In terms of
optimize
memory.
in terms of memory footprint. And again, like I said, I have a feeling that like most Circle CI containers are, I think, given like a gig of memory by default or something. Yeah, if your app is already breaking the bank on a gig of memory, you've probably got a lot of other concerns.
How many locales does it support?
So
There was quite a few.
I'm gonna.
Have they translated any of these into?
So there is some. Oh, that's the wrong one.
So
Yeah.
the names thing is particularly interesting because I've done a lot of stuff with other names. Like, so for instance, in North America, we don't actually collate most Dutch names properly. Like, so Dahan is actually an H, it's not under D. In North America, we always put it under D. The DE, which is lowercase, is actually not part of the last name.
DA, that's Danish, so Denmark Danish. So here you can see that they've added some addresses, company changes so that you can see like they have different set of suffixes. Same with their internet domain. They've given you a little bit more. So there, for example, is one with a non-standard character with that. I actually don't know what that's called.
No with a slash.
Yeah. They've also translated some of their prefixes, so titles. I don't know what can meg or can jur is, but so again,
In a lot of languages in Europe, prefixes occur after the name, even doctor.
yeah, so they'd be suffixes, but again, so it really does depend. Like again, because it is using I18N, it should default. Like if your app is by default using French, it should default to using the French versions. But you will be probably more limited in what libraries are available as opposed to if you're using the English, because everyone speaks English, and so that's the dominant, what everyone has filled it out in. Oh, I went back too far. So again, not guaranteed, and I mean they even have some variations for English Canada, and you can see that their postcode generation is going to be different than if you just use the generic one. Similarly, it's going to give you states that are
The
provinces.
state and based on this,
Yeah, I'm not touching that one. Probably somewhere.
I use something similar where I just check the digits.
Yeah, so you do definitely get a little bit of variation depending on your locale. But again, if you are looking at a different language, you're probably going to be a little bit more limited in what you see versus whoever did the French Canadian added the same address and phone number stuff there too.
Did anyone use that library like Carmen? It used to be all about like countries and provinces and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've used Carmen myself. It's
It's not supported anymore. I'm just wondering if Faker would be like a informative source somehow of all the
yeah,
herds of countries.
probably not because again, like they obviously have that postal code regex, but there's no guarantee that it generates a valid postal code, right?
Sure.
Like it generates something that looks valid.
Yeah.
And-
use that postal code to like validate your address widget or whatever.
Sure, but I would recommend pulling it out of and doing the validation elsewhere as opposed to trying to say like, hey, Faker, is this a valid thing? Because that's not what Faker's meant to do.
That'd be much more reasonable.
So,
You mentioned that one of the things you have to keep in mind when you use Faker is you can't rely on the fact that it's going to be random forever because obviously you're running the data. Have you run across any gotchas on the other side of things where it might give you a false sense of security that you should kind of be mindful and careful about?
not really. I mean, in my experience, I've actually found that the randomization is helpful at times. In some ways, because when you get, for example, if you get a flaky test and it keeps failing because the name is whatever, you start to see a pattern in the names that it fails on versus every other name. But I try very hard not to write my tests expecting them to have like perfectly random data or very consistent data. If it needs to have very consistent data, I should not be using a random generator to create it. But again, so I haven't really experienced that, but other people's experiences may vary.
Okay.
I can't say I've seen where it gives you a false sense. I will agree though that having something that generates, I think you do get a false sense from when you fix the data,
Yeah.
right? From years of writing tests where the data was specifically fixed when you look for a certain thing. When you find out that this changes, right? When you're doing something where it's really meant to handle a wide number of cases, having something that generates those wider number of cases behind you will find something that you didn't realize was there on the authentication.
You didn't think that this was a possibility.
Yeah,
Phone numbers
exactly.
can only be exactly 9 digits, right?
Bingo, yeah.
They call that like fuzz testing, right? Where
Yeah.
you're just kind of always changing what we're running our SAS app for Vertinom now, and there's people that sign up with like emojis in their names, just like things that I would never type into email.
Yeah.
They do.
It does kind of tie into that series of things programmers believe about X, right? Like all names have at least a first and last name. That's not true.
No.
And some of the names generated by Faker conform to that. Not all, but some do. So it's
Yeah, it'll do things like that. So if you have, right?
yes.
I mean, there's a consistent approach. You see it constantly where people go middle name.
Yeah.
Right, and when they're defining it. I actually worked on some international standards for healthcare about persons' names. And so you hit all of these things,
People like
For
26
instance, in
different
Aboriginal
names.
culture in Australia, your name can be different depending on where you are.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, the
Norwegians don't have a middle name traditionally, although now they're starting to adopt their mother's maiden name. As there's a whole bunch of things like this that come out. That
So-
DE thing in
So,
Dutch.
so should I use a string field or a text field?
That's actually kind of a good question.
that depends on your
Actually, the way we
database, and it
solve
probably
is
doesn't
we
matter.
have a list
String
of
goes down to
given
an engineering challenge.
and a family name, because depending on the culture,
Sure.
you put them in different orders.
Yeah.
Honestly, I hate it. I half my set are like first name, last name is like 2 separate string fields, and then some of them are just like names.
Well, I mean, it's actually a problem. I know a few people that only have one name
Yeah.
because that's just it. And
But
so
they're used to living in a world of
so-
computers and people that are
for example, when they apply for credit cards, they have to repeat their name because credit cards don't.
Oh, yeah, there's.
Except
there's
that you
so
have
many of these old-style
one
systems
name.
that, you know, and the same thing with medical systems. and
So,
stuff like that.
you know, it's again, there's no guarantee that Faker will generate all of the data that you need to prove those concepts or disprove those, but it gives you a little bit more of that fuzziness that you might get something you weren't expecting, and maybe it's like, well, that's just never going to happen. In which case, okay, well, you can adjust your data at that point, but.
Yeah, you'll find the 2 or 3 extra bugs that are, you know, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't think that was possible.
Every once in a while, my tools impress me, and I'm just like, oh wow, like all this testing BS I've been doing like actually worked. It saved my butt on this one.
Oh, look, this is a thing, and now I'm discovering instead of a customer discovering it.
That's true. Yeah.
That's always, you know, better than.
So I'm not sure if Faker has it, but I know there's other libraries. There's just like a huge list of like known bad string inputs, and there's all these like strings with strange control characters, and like I'm sure Hunter 2 is in there somewhere or whatever. That could be interesting to run against your app as well.
So they actually have a string,
Yeah.
and so they have a string library, and it will generate a random string. And here you can see it will use, you know, I don't know if that's Korean or Japanese or, sorry, I zoomed out because it was difficult to navigate. You know, there's a Unicode character, there's a whole host of non-ABCD characters. So, you know, again, I think that the string is a little bit more designed for that of, hey, I'm going to give you, again, it might give you just, you know, standard ABCD. Actually, let's find out. Faker string. Oh, I called it wrong. So yeah, there you can see it's definitely giving me some very non-standard characters. And it looks like it very consistently does that, so that would be a great way to test some of your fields.
Varying encoding, like, or can you give you a string that is ASCII characters or?
Thought so.
I was gonna say, someone shared this on a Slack where it was like a piece of text that read like a normal, like 3 or 4 word sentence. But the trick was that when you tried to highlight it, it just went all weird on your mouse and
Yeah.
go separately. Because it was actually a play on all the left and right Unicode characters that was like a very carefully constructed string to look normal, but when you try to highlight it,
It looked like it was
all over
a
the place.
15-character string, but it was actually a 132-character string.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's just like that. That was cool.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, because I think what they were doing is they were like using the left and right Unicode characters to like align the characters. So they'd actually typed the characters in completely different order, but then would shove them over to the right or shove them to the left wherever they needed to be in the position of the sentence.
You know your Unicode. That's exactly it. Yeah, they type them out of order. and, like,
Guess who's had to deal with that kind of shit?
combines them and it somehow like works out to the right order.
Yeah.
Origami in text.
Pretty much. So, so yeah, it looks like Faker, the string would give you some like non-standard characters, or some very standard characters depending on where you live, and that would be a good way to kind of try and test some of your text fields to see if they support that.
I'm so glad Rails supports all that crap. You never will have to think about that.
And the fact that you can have emoji characters as variable names in Ruby, so
It works.
that's always fun.
Somehow.
So yeah, any other questions or statements or conversation points?
If not, well, thank you, Susan.
Too long didn't read? Use Faker.